worked as a janitor at Ridgway High for nearly 20 years. He liked the quiet of the building after the students and teachers had gone home. There was something peaceful about mopping empty hallways and hearing the distant hum of fluorescent lights. But recently, that peace had been shattered. It started last Monday, a chilly October evening. As Mark polished the lockers near the gymnasium, he thought he heard the faint echo of footsteps. Turning, he found only the darkened hall behind him. He shook it off, probably just his imagination. By Wednesday, it was harder to ignore. While cleaning a classroom, he saw movement in the corner of his eye. A shadow slipped past the window on the door. Heart pounding, Mark stepped into the hallway. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling slightly. The only answer was the low groan of the building settling. Thursday night, the power went out. Mark had just wheeled his cart into the cafeteria when the lights flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He cursed under his breath and fumbled for his flashlight. The beam cut through the pitch black, but it only seemed to make the shadows deeper. As he swept the light across the room, he caught sight of a figure standing at the far end, tall and featureless, like a silhouette burned into his vision. "Who's there?" Mark demanded. Though his voice wavered, the figure didn't move, didn't speak. When Mark took a step closer, it vanished, leaving only silence behind. By Friday, Mark was ready to quit. But quitting wasn't that simple. He needed the job. He told himself it was just the stress, the loneliness of working nights getting to him. He resolved to finish his shift and then maybe talk to his boss about switching to daytime hours. That night, as he mopped the science wing, Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket. He frowned. It was nearly midnight. Pulling it out, he saw a message from an unknown number saying, "You're not alone." The mop clattered to the floor as Mark's hands went numb. His first thought was to leave, to get out of the building. But his keys were in the janitor's closet on the other side of the school. He began moving quickly down the hall, his footsteps echoing too loudly in his ears. As he rounded a corner, he froze. The figure was back, standing in front of the janitor's closet, its head tilted slightly, almost as if it were watching him. Mark's flashlight flickered, and the figure disappeared again, leaving the hallway eerily still. Gathering what courage he had left, Mark sprinted for the closet. He yanked the door open and slammed it behind him, pressing his back against the cold metal. His keys dangled from a hook on the wall, and he grabbed them with shaking hands. But before he could open the door, something scratched against it. Slow and deliberate. Mark held his breath. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low whisper. He couldn't make out the words, but it was coming from inside the closet. Slowly, Mark turned the flashlight toward the far corner of the room. The beam illuminated shelves of cleaning supplies, a broom leaning against the wall, and a face, pale, eyeless, and grinning. The door slammed shut behind him, and Mark's scream echoed through the school. By Monday morning, no one could find him. His cart was abandoned in the hallway, his phone on the floor near the janitor's closet. The principal called the police, but they turned up nothing. Ridgway High reopened the next day, students filling the halls once more. But late at night, when the building is empty, some say you can still hear the faint sound of footsteps in the science wing and the whisper of a mop sliding across the floor. Never been one to follow rules. She wore detentions like badges of honor, little testaments to her rebellion against Ridgway High's authority. But when Mr. Dunbar handed her a week's worth of after-school detention for skipping class, her smirk faded. Detention in room 303, alone, every day after dark. That was a punishment even she didn't find amusing. The rumors about room 303 had been whispered among students for years. Stories of a freezing chill, strange noises, and the feeling of being watched. Clara didn't believe in ghost stories, but even she had to admit there was something off about that room. It always seemed colder than the rest of the school, no matter the season. Monday evening, she dragged her feet to 303, plopping into the nearest desk and pulling out her phone. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the otherwise silent room. She played games and scrolled through social media, passing the time until the hour was up. Aside from the chill in the air, nothing happened. But then came Tuesday. She noticed it almost immediately. Writing on the desk she hadn't seen the day before. It wasn't graffiti, though. It was carved deep into the wood, as though someone had used a knife. The words read, "Help me." Clara ran her fingers over the grooves, the edges rough against her skin. A faint giggle echoed in the empty room. She froze, glancing at the doorway. No one. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky with the racing of her heart. The door creaked slightly in response, as if the old hinges were mocking her. Wednesday was worse. When she arrived, the writing on the desk had changed. It now read, "Look under." Her stomach turned, but curiosity got the better of her. Kneeling down, she peered beneath the desk. Taped there was a photograph, old and yellowed with age. It showed a group of children in black and white, standing outside what looked like Ridgway High. Most of the faces were faded, but one stood out, a girl in the back row with hollow eyes and a wide, unnatural grin. The room's temperature plummeted. Clara's breath came out in visible puffs. The clock on the wall stopped ticking, its hands frozen at 3:03. She bolted, leaving the photo behind. By Thursday, Clara was determined to tell Mr. Dunbar she wouldn't go back to room 303. But when she arrived at the office, he wasn't there. No one seemed to be around. Confused, she checked her phone. 6:30 p.m. The office should still be open. Defeated, she returned to the classroom. The photo was back on the desk. The girl's grin was wider now, and her hollowed eyes seemed to follow Clara wherever she moved. The words carved into the desk had changed again. "Stay with me." That night, the giggling returned, louder and closer. The air was heavy and suffocating. The door slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating through the room. Panicked, Clara yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lights flickered violently, then went out. In the darkness, she heard it, soft shuffling footsteps coming toward her. "No," she whispered, scared, backing into the corner. A voice, faint and childlike, whispered in her ear, "Why did you leave me?" Clara screamed. Friday came, but Clara didn't show up for detention. Her friends reported her missing that evening. Police searched the school and found her belongings in room 303, but no sign of Clara. When her parents asked the principal to investigate further, he shook his head sadly. "We stopped using that room years ago. No one's been assigned detention there." Later, a custodian cleaning room 303 found something odd carved into the desk. Who's next? Rumors spread fast. Students who dared to enter room 303 claimed they felt cold hands brushing against their shoulders or heard faint whispers begging them to stay, and every so often they'd see a face in the dark, hollow-eyed, grinning too wide. Ridgway High quietly sealed off room 303, but the stories didn't stop, and those who disappeared never returned. David hated the night shift. He'd taken the job as Ridgway High's security guard after his construction business folded, and it wasn't glamorous work. His nights consisted of pacing dark hallways, staring at flickering security monitors, and occasionally chasing off teenagers who thought sneaking into the school after hours was a good idea. The school was a maze after dark. Shadows stretched long and deep, swallowing corners, and the hum of the fluorescent lights felt almost alive. But David was used to that. What he wasn't used to were the doors. It started 2 weeks into the job. While patrolling the east wing, David noticed a door at the end of the hallway. It was unmarked and seemed out of place, its faded green paint standing out against the beige walls. He frowned. He'd walked this hallway a dozen times and never noticed it before. When he tried the handle, it didn't budge. Odd, but not worth worrying about. He filed it away in his mind and moved on. But the door didn't go away. Every night it was there, always at the end of the east wing, always locked. When he mentioned it to Mr. Caldwell, the head custodian, the man just stared at him. "There's no door in the east wing," Caldwell said firmly, his face pale. David didn't press further, but his curiosity grew. The next night he returned with a flashlight, determined to investigate. The door seemed older up close, the wood warped and chipped. A chill crept up his spine as he examined it, his flashlight flickering. Then, faintly, he heard it. A knock. David froze. The knock came again, louder this time. He pressed his ear to the door, holding his breath. On the other side, a voice whispered his name. David. His blood ran cold. He stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight, and fled down the hall. The door began to haunt him. Every night it felt closer, as though the hallway was growing shorter, pushing him toward it. The whispers followed him, faint at first, then louder. They weren't just from the door anymore. They came from the walls, the vents, the ceiling. "David, help us." By the third week, David was losing sleep. He pored over the building's blueprints, searching for any record of the door. There was none. The east wing should have ended in a blank wall. Frustrated, he turned to the school's history, digging through dusty archives in the principal's office. That's when he found it. Ridgway High had been built over the ruins of St. Alora's orphanage, which had burned down in the early 1900s. 23 children had died in the fire, along with the headmaster. David found an old photo of the orphanage staff, and his stomach dropped. In the back row stood a man who looked eerily familiar, his features a perfect match to the janitor, Mark, who'd vanished weeks earlier. The next night, David decided to confront the door. Armed with a crowbar, he made his way to the east wing. The door stood waiting, its green paint seeming darker, almost black in the dim light. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices pleading and wailing. He pried the door open. It didn't lead to a storage closet or another room. It led to a staircase spiraling downward into pitch-black darkness. The air reeked of decay and burnt wood. Against his better judgment, David descended, the sound echoing endlessly. When he reached the bottom, his flashlight flickered again, revealing a vast underground chamber. The walls were scorched, and the floor was littered with broken toys and children's shoes. At the center of the room was a circle of desks, each one marked with a name carved deep into the wood. He recognized one immediately, Clara. The desk looked charred, but the carving was fresh. The whispers grew deafening, and David turned, his flashlight sweeping across the room. Shadows darted out of its beam, but he caught glimpses of them. Small, hunched figures with hollow eyes and charred skin. "Help us!" one of them rasped, its voice barely human. David's instinct was to run, but something in their eyes stopped him. They weren't attacking. They were begging. Before he could speak, a new sound filled the room, the creak of the staircase. David whipped around to see the door slamming shut above him. The whispers turned to screams, and the figures began to swarm. He swung his flashlight wildly, but it was no use. The last thing he saw before the light went out was the face of a child, its grin impossibly wide. David didn't show up for work the next day. His patrol log was found on the desk in the security office. The final entry reading, "Doors open." The principal dismissed his disappearance as another fluke, a casualty of poor hiring choices. That night, the East Wing was sealed off without explanation, and the rumors began again. Students claim you can still hear David's footsteps echoing in the halls at night. Others say, if you find the green door and knock 3 times, you'll hear him knocking. Still trapped, still searching for a way out. The rain hammered against the windows of Ridgway High, turning the world outside into a blurred gray canvas. Inside, the halls were empty, except for Mrs. Prescott, the school's history teacher. She had stayed late to finish grading essays on the Civil War, her desk piled high with blue-inked papers and coffee cups. As she stacked the last essay, she noticed something odd on the corner of her desk. A small, leather-bound book she hadn't seen before. The cover was cracked with age. the black leather so worn it seemed to absorb the light around it. There was no title or markings, only a faint symbol embossed on the spine, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, almost like a sun. Curiosity piqued, Mrs. Prescott opened the book. Its yellowed pages were covered in names, each written in elegant, looping handwriting. She recognized some of the surnames, students and teachers who had passed through Ridgway High over the years. But the farther she flipped, the stranger the entries became. Some names were crossed out with thick black ink, while others had symbols next to them that she didn't recognize. At the very back, she found a blank page, except for one name scrawled in fresh ink, Margaret Prescott. Her breath caught. She slammed the book shut and shoved it into her bag. The storm outside intensified as she locked her classroom and hurried home, the feeling of unseen, demonic, and horrific eyes following her every step. The next morning, Mrs. Prescott couldn't shake the unease. She decided to return the book to the school library, thinking it might be some misplaced archive. But the librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, frowned at the sight of it. "This isn't ours," she said, running her fingers over the cracked leather. "I've never seen anything like it." Mrs. Prescott explained where she'd found it, but Mrs. Hargrove only shook her head. "That book, it doesn't belong here. Be careful, Margaret, please." Her words lingered in Mrs. Prescott's mind as she returned to her classroom. She set the book on a shelf and tried to forget about it. But as the day wore on, strange things began to happen. The first was the clock. It froze at 3:03. No matter how many times she reset it, the hands refused to move. Then came the whispers, faint at first like a draft through the vents, but growing louder as the hours passed. They weren't words so much as an urgent murmur, pulling at the edges of her sanity. By evening, the book was back on her desk, though she hadn't touched it since leaving it on the shelf. She opened it again, desperate for answers, and found the pages covered in frantic scrawled writing. Her name appeared over and over, followed by the same phrase, "Read them aloud." Against her better judgment, she did. The moment she spoke the first name, the air in the room grew heavy. The temperature plummeted, her breath visible in the dim light. Shadows pooled in the corners of the classroom, deepening until they seemed alive. She read the second name, then the third. With each one, the room seemed to warp, the walls closing in, the fluorescent lights flickering erratically. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling and full of terror. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man in a charred suit, his face featureless, except for empty and deep black eyes. He tilted his head as if listening, then began to walk toward her. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, growing louder with each step. Panicking, she tried to close the book, but her hands wouldn't move. They were frozen, as if the book itself was holding her in place. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from inside her own head. The figure stopped inches away. In a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. "Finish the list." "No," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I won't," she said, crying. The figure tilted its head further, its empty dark eyes narrowing. Then it reached out, its fingers impossibly long, and touched the book. The next morning, Mrs. Prescott's classroom was empty. Her bag, her coat, and her lesson plans were still on her desk, but she was gone. The black book lay open, her name crossed out in thick black ink. When the janitor found the book and handed it to the principal, it was dismissed as a strange prank. The principal locked it in his office, but by the end of the day it was back in the classroom, waiting on a new desk. By the next week, students began reporting a strange phenomenon. Every time they walked by Mrs. Prescott's classroom, they felt a cold breeze and heard faint whispers. Some claimed they saw her shadow moving behind the desk, though the room had been locked since her disappearance. And in the library, Mrs. Hargrove swore she found a new name written in the book. Daniel Caldwell. The sound of music echoed faintly through Ridgway High's empty halls. The choir room had always been Mr. Ellis's sanctuary. After 20 years of directing the school choir, he had mastered the acoustics of the space. He could make a single note resonate like an orchestra and silence a restless group of teenagers with just a wave of his hand. But tonight, something was off. It started with the sheet music. While reorganizing the choir room's old filing cabinets, Mr. Ellis stumbled upon a piece he'd never seen before, the Lament of Saint Elora. The music was handwritten, its staff lines uneven, and the notes erratic. The title caught his attention. Saint Elora, the orphanage Ridgway High was supposedly built upon. Curiosity got the better of him. He set the sheet on the piano and began to play. The notes were haunting, dissonant yet captivating. As he played, he felt a chill creep through the room, the air growing heavier with each measure. The final chord echoed longer than it should have, as though the sound itself had lingered in the walls. He shook off the unease and placed the sheet back in the cabinet. It was just an old, eerie song, nothing more. The next morning, during choir practice, the sheet music was waiting for him on the piano. Mr. Ellis frowned. He was certain he'd put it away. But something about the melody haunted him, and before he realized it, he was passing copies of the song to his students. "All right, let's try something new," he said, standing tall at the podium. The students began singing. At first, their voices stumbled over the unfamiliar notes, but as they repeated the song, their harmonies grew stronger. The music filled the room, strange and beautiful. But then, the temperature dropped. Mr. Ellis noticed his breath fogging in the air. The lights above flickered, casting the students' shadows against the walls. He raised his hands to stop them, but the students didn't, or couldn't, stop singing. Their eyes were distant, unfocused, as if they were somewhere else entirely. The harmonies became distorted, otherworldly. The room itself seemed to change. The once bright walls now looked cracked and scorched, and the floor felt uneven, as though warped by heat. "Stop!" Mr. Ellis shouted, slamming his hands on the piano. The music ceased. The students blinked, confused, as if waking from a trance. "What was that?" asked Lisa, one of the sopranos, her voice shaking. Mr. Ellis didn't have an answer. That night he couldn't sleep. The melody replayed in his mind, each note pulling him deeper into unease. He found himself pacing his living room, humming the song under his breath. By the time the grandfather clock chimed 3 in the morning, he realized he'd been humming for hours. He decided to destroy the sheet music. Returning to the choir room the next day, he found the students already gathered, sitting in eerie silence. No one spoke, and yet they all seemed to be humming the same tune, the lament. "Who told you to come early?" he asked, his voice trembling. They didn't respond. Their eyes were blank, their lips barely moving as the haunting melody filled the air. "Enough!" he yelled, snatching the sheet music and tearing it apart. The humming stopped. The students stared at him, wide-eyed and frightened, as though waking from a dream. "Practice is canceled. Go home," he said, his voice cracking. That night, Mr. Ellis stayed late, determined to uncover the truth. He searched the archives, his fingers trembling as he flipped through dusty records. Finally, he found it. The Lament of Saint Elora wasn't just a song. It was part of a ritual used by the orphanage's headmaster to summon something. The records were incomplete, but one note stood out. "The song opens the way." Ellis's stomach churned as the lights flickered above him. He heard it then, a faint humming coming from the choir room. When he returned to the room, the students were there, though it was long after hours. They stood in perfect formation, their eyes closed, their mouths moving in unison. The torn sheet music was back on the piano, whole and unblemished. The song filled the room, louder and more chilling than ever. Shadows swirled in the corners, growing thicker with each note. "Stop!" Mr. Ellis cried, but his voice was drowned out by the music. The shadows coalesced into a figure, a tall, thin man in a tattered suit. His face was hollow, his eyes glowing faintly as he raised a hand toward the students. Ellis ran to the piano, slamming the lid shut. The music stopped abruptly, the students collapsing to the floor like marionettes with their strings cut. The shadowy figure dissolved, but not before whispering a single word: soon. The next morning, the students couldn't remember what had happened. They were fine, but Ellis wasn't. His hair had gone gray overnight, and he spoke little. He tried to warn the principal, but his concerns were dismissed as stress. A week later, Ellis's resignation letter appeared on the principal's desk. He left town, never to be heard from again. But the choir room didn't stay silent for long. Late at night, janitors and teachers would hear faint humming emanating from the walls, always the same dissonant tune. Students claimed the sheet music still appeared on the piano from time to time, though no one dared to sing it. And every so often, a shadow would linger in the corner of the room, watching, waiting. The air in Ridgway High felt heavier than usual, a palpable tension woven into the walls. The remaining characters, Clara, David, Mrs. Prescott, and Mr. Ellis, stood at the entrance to the basement, the culmination of weeks of terror and cryptic discoveries. They had pieced together the story. Ridgway High was built atop the remains of a 19th century orphanage, where unspeakable rituals were conducted by its headmaster. The entity summoned during those rituals now thrived on the guilt and fears of its victims, feeding on the living through manipulation and torment. Clara held the flashlight, her fingers trembling as the beam illuminated the rusted hinges of the basement door. "It's locked," she whispered, her voice almost drowned out by the oppressive silence. "Not for long," David replied, producing a crowbar. His nights as the school's security guard had prepared him for breaking into places, but not for what awaited beyond the door. With a groan of metal and splintering wood, the door swung open, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. The group hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. Mrs. Prescott clutched the black book tightly against her chest, its weight both literal and figurative. "We're not turning back now," Mr. Ellis said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We've come too far." As they descended, the atmosphere grew colder, the steps creaking under their weight. The walls were lined with faded childlike scrawls, in a language none of them could decipher. Clara's flashlight flickered, and for a moment, they were plunged into pitch blackness. "Keep moving," David urged, his voice sharp with unease. The sound of his footsteps echoed, but something about the echo felt wrong, as if the sound was coming from somewhere else entirely. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a cavernous space. The walls were lined with shelves holding dusty artifacts, old toys, yellowed papers, and unlit candles. At the center of the room was Mark, the janitor, who had disappeared months ago. He was crouched on the floor, his fingers tracing symbols into the dirt. His skin was pale, stretched taut over his bones, and his lips moved soundlessly as if whispering to unseen listeners. "Mark?" Clara called softly, taking a hesitant step forward. He didn't react. It was as if he didn't hear her, his focus entirely consumed by the symbols he was creating. The air in the room began to hum, a low vibration that rattled their teeth. "He's gone," Mrs. Prescott said, her voice quivering. "Or at least, what's left of him isn't Mark anymore." Suddenly, the symbols on the ground flared to life, glowing a sickly green. The hum intensified, and the room seemed to warp, the walls bending inward as though the space itself were alive. "It knows we're here," Mr. Ellis said, his eyes darting around the room. "We need to end this, now." Mrs. Prescott stepped forward, opening the black book. The names inside were no longer written in any language she recognized. They shifted and writhed on the page, each name accompanied by a searing pain in her head. "It feeds on our guilt," she murmured. "We have to confront it. That's the only way to weaken it." The room erupted into chaos. Shadows rose from the walls, coalescing into twisted forms that resembled their deepest fears. Clara saw her mother, pale and lifeless, reaching out with bloodied hands. David faced a younger version of himself, uniform torn and bloodied, a memory of a tragic accident he had tried to forget. Mr. Ellis was confronted by a choir of his students, their mouths open in silent screams. Mrs. Prescott's vision was of a classroom filled with blank, accusing faces. "It's not real!" Clara shouted, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to break free from the apparition's grasp. "It's all in our heads." "But it's feeding on us as if it is," David yelled back, swinging his crowbar at the shadowy figure looming over him. The weapon passed through harmlessly, and the figure only grew stronger. "Face it," Mrs. Prescott cried out, clutching the book. "Admit your guilt. That's the only way to stop it." One by one, they confronted their fears. Clara screamed into the void, admitting her guilt over the way she had treated her family before her mother's death. David fell to his knees, tears streaming as he confessed to leaving a colleague behind in an accident that had cost a life. Mr. Ellis whispered apologies to his students for failing to protect them from a tragedy he'd always blamed himself for. Mrs. Prescott dropped the book, sobbing as she admitted her regret for sacrificing her personal life for a career that felt meaningless now. As they spoke their truths, the shadows recoiled, their forms flickering and dissipating. The symbols on the ground began to fade, and the hum in the air quieted to a whisper. Mark collapsed, his body crumpling to the floor. The glow in the room extinguished, and the space felt normal, silent, empty. "Is it over?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. David helped her to her feet, nodding slowly. "For now." They ascended the staircase together, leaving the horrors of the basement behind. As they emerged into the cool night air, the school loomed behind them, dark and foreboding. They knew the entity wasn't truly gone, only weakened. Ridgway High would always carry its scars, but for now they had survived. And survival, they realized, was its own kind of victory.